going to change topics now and talk about the alien agenda, as it's been termed. The idea that we're all going to be invaded by little men from Mars or from somewhere in a far-off land, something like akin to Star Trek or something. Alan, in your research, where did this idea first come from?
Again, it came from the think tanks which were involved in, again, like the Fabian Society and all the other associated think tanks, which are massive today, of how to, if the people are catching on, there's too many things are wrong at any particular time, you must give them something to look at that could even be religious. So they came up with the idea, and also to unify the world. Remember, the goal was always to have world government with these groups, or world domination. And to get the people to go along with these things, they push up along the Marxist line that continuous war is so destructive, which of course it is, etc., etc. And we can't go on like this. We need some outside intervention. If only something outside would come and force us to unite the world to fight it, then we'd all come together under a global structure, which would be necessary to defend us all. And then they came out, of course, with the big movie. It was the day the Earth stood still, where a big flying saucer lands outside the White House, I think it was. And the whole idea is that this alien has to get in touch with members of the United Nations, scientific members, though. They have to all be scientists that tie in again with scientists running the world. And so he goes off and search for the scientists that would eventually put it across to the public. If they wouldn't unite together to stop their destructive behavior, then these aliens would eventually have to destroy you because you were dangerous. And you can go back further. They came out about 1948 with supposedly the first sightings of UFOs over the White House. The guy who saw them all in an aircraft but happened to be a CIA member. So it's the same old thing again, giving people this fake pantomime to an extent. It's something to believe in. Something would take over from standard religions again and get them working towards something. And initially they brought forth something like the aliens are here to help us. That really took off. And then with the whole scientific age of going to the moon, all of that, they pushed all the science fictions, Star Trek, etc. It's interesting that how Star Trek series was put together, because they gave you situations on Earth with different peoples, races, wherever it happened to be, and put it into outer space to show you that the Enterprise, interesting name too, the Enterprise, because it's also God bless us on this Enterprise, you pluribus unum and so on in the States. But Enterprise is to do with markets, and economy, etc. So it goes around the space, trying to unite all the planets into a global, universal federation, which is simply the United Nations. And they give you the unfair things that happen to minorities on the way, and they make them all free, etc., and bring them into this great trading group in outer space. And the ones who will not join this federation are always the bad guys. They're primitive, barbaric, etc. It was simply a projection of everything in the world that the Fabians and so on had been pushing for such a long time already, put into an outer space setting for a unified world. But it fascinated so many people the way it was done. But you also find top leaders like Lesser B. Pearson of Canada, who also was head of the United Nations for a while, but he also became Prime Minister. And I've got his books here, his old books, and one of his workers was also a high-level bureaucrat in Canada who was called Escott Reed. And Escott Reed said in his memoirs, when he worked with Pearson, he says, we drafted up, along with Alger Hiss, who was a communist boy who eventually was found guilty, etc., for treason. But they drafted it up, the whole charter of the United Nations, to try and unify them all, again heading towards world government. And he said in his book, he says, make no mistake, our goal is world government. Well, that's never been given up yet today. That's what the United Nations is there for. The United Nations was set up from the League of Nations, and they were both set up by, again, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. Same group. Same guys that wrote up your amalgamation into Europe for Britain, and the guys who drafted up the NAFTA agreement for the amalgamation of the Americas too. They openly said that in Canada. They drafted it up and presented it, and it was signed. These are private organizations, remember. Now, Lester B. Pearson, back in 1957, had a similar idea to the day the Earth stood still, and it says, perhaps there is a hopeful possibility here in the conquest of outer space. Interplanetary activity may well give us planetary peace. Once we discover Martian space, it's always Mars, going right back to H.G. Wells, Martian spaceships hovering above Earth's space, we will all come together. How dare they threaten us like this? We shall shout as one at a really united nations, and so there was to bring the earth together to fight them. This is a guy who was way up there at the United Nations and as a prime minister. So this was followed on. Ronald Reagan mentioned it many times during his time in office as almost an outer threat from outer space would all come together. It's been a great thing to create a mass mind control movement of people who are dedicated followers of ufology, as they call it, and make them all work towards what really is this Marxist system towards a global system, and where they'd use all our tax money against a tax base from the workers to explore space, etc., which really, again, was a caveat, because the whole idea was to put up all the technology that they eventually would use to monitor all of us. That's what the Star Wars program in Reagan's era was all about. It was nothing to do with shooting down satellites. It was to do with what would be used today. Before we even had the computer, they were putting this stuff up in space, getting it all ready, because they knew when they were going to give us the computers to monitor us and the cell phones and everything else. This is how it really works. It's very clever, and we're led like, by the nose, like bulls by the nose, by our masters of the mind. It's perfect. They've never given it up today. Yeah.
Well, people have been seeing lights in the sky forever. It's a well-documented phenomena going back centuries and thousands, millennia going back. And it's only since the late 1940s that people have been coached to see a strange phenomenon of a light in the sky. It's automatically an alien spaceship. Lights in the sky have always been seen long before this, particularly at times of great emotional or psychological or social stress. For instance, they were very highly recorded during the time of the Ottoman Empire, when it looked like the Ottoman Empire was going to overrun Europe. People in communities in Austria and Germany and Switzerland were having these visions of lights in the sky. And at the time, they believed that they were aliens, that were coming to save them from Islam. I believe that these actual experiences are probably either plasma or else they are actually psychedelic experience, some kind of collective psychedelic experience of some kind. But they've copper-fastened the idea again that they're aliens. Now, there's a strong connection I've discovered going back through Germany and all this. In the very first high-quality science fiction films ever made were made in the massive UAF movie studios just outside Berlin in the 1920s. And you had directors like Fritz Lang making films like Metropolis and The Woman in the Moon. These were very well-made science fiction films. Fritz Lang was an interesting character. He said, if you want to get people to believe in science fiction, the whole focus must be on making the actual process of the spaceships and how they operate and fly as believable as possible. So he put tremendous resources for the 1920s into building realistic models of spaceships, realistic portrayals of the lunar landscape, of alien beings, of future worlds. And so much so that this had been part of a kind of continuum in Germany since about the 1870s, when an English guy wrote a book, a guy called Edward Llewellyn Lytton, I think was his name. He wrote a book called Vril, The Coming of the Power Race. It was basically a science fiction novel about these kind of alien angelic beings that lived inside the earth. And the book was such a sensation when it was translated into Germany that you had these people like Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky walking around with a copy of it under their arms like it was the Bible, saying that the book was absolutely true. No way could it be fiction. It has to be true. So you had the first widespread belief in this kind of alien salvation race was the genesis and the gestation place took place in Germany at the turn of the century, and then moving up towards the era of National Socialism, where it was, totally believed in, completely, especially as the films that had been made in Berlin at the time were so good. Now, what really took off in the West was the Roswell incident. And now, what do we have at Roswell? We have a guy holding a pieces of tin foil, and that's basically it. A newspaper and a story about flying saucers, always on a military base. They're always on military bases, these big sightings, and no one ever puts one and one together and then realizes the whole thing is a psyop. But anyway, your man, this guy, Jesse, what's his name? I can't remember his second name, the Air Force guy, pictures of metal, little stories about an alien flying disc crashes. Then the story is deliberately suppressed to make people think that it actually happened or the government is covering up something. And they do not put because it happened in 1947, they do not put the obvious conclusion that this was a psychological operation developed by German and Nazi scientists brought over during Operation Paperclip, who had been running the same psyops towards the end of the defeat of National Socialism by building up this idea that the Fuhrer had a wonder weapon that had been derived from miraculous sources that was going to save the Third Reich in its final moments. The same German minds were brought over to the United States, given jobs in the OSS, as you said, the forerunner of the CIA, and MI5, the modern version, and they were given this brief to use the same kind of ideas of the weapon in the minds of people, because the United States had to create they knew they had this phobia and this anxiety was coming along because the Russians were about to detonate an atomic bomb because of Marxist groups in the US that leaked the secrets over through sort of a Bolshevist sympathy network into the Soviet Union. And they had to condition Americans to believe that we somehow have alien technology, spaceman technology is going to save us. We have the edge. And that continued all during the Cold War, right up until Reagan's Star Wars announcement at the United Nations that we would all band together and to fight a global force from an alien force from outer space with a global army. And you had it in silly films like Independence Day, where you see the Israeli jet fighter guys looking at the Iranian jet fighter guys and giving them the thumbs up, and all this kind of like nonsense, this kind of like one world fighting the aliens. And of course, you had the amazing closing ceremonies of the 1984 Olympics of a spaceship landing in the stadium in Los Angeles and a big plastic alien coming out and talking about how he approves of humanity coming together, as if they're not going to blow us up if we continue to like work together and all this kind. And and yet people, to this day, it amazes me that people cannot, when it comes to this UFO stuff, this alien stuff, they cannot look at the obvious conclusions that we're just being played for suckers here. That there's so many other explanations for these mysterious phenomena, which I completely agree do exist. But everyone's conditioned with the knee-jerk thing. It's an alien in a spaceship who's come to Earth, and they're either here to destroy us if we don't behave ourselves, or save us if we do.
Yeah, that's a good part of it. And then Russia, and again, too, Germany they were the leaders of the scientific age, even in the 1800s through the early 1900s, and they were even making a lot of individuals were making small rockets to go up, into the sky. And they were fascinated by this whole idea. And it tied in with the age of nationalism as well, and how, again, not just weaponry, but advanced science would come from a super nationalist type system. And then they created the Vril Society. And the Vril Society was again the society that came up with the idea of super weapons that Hitler would eventually use, etc. Out of this world type science that would be involved in, etc. And also came up with the idea that ties in with this Vril Society of the inner Earth. They put that out there too. The inner Earth society. There's actually an inner Earth society with the black sun inside the Earth, and people live there, etc. And Bulwer Lytton, who was a lord in Britain, I think, eventually he wrote a book about it, a fascinating novel that others copied in many ways, to do with these super advanced beings that now lived inside the Earth. And they're still pushing that same stuff today with Mount Shasta in the US. But getting back to the whole CIA operation, it's massively funded, this, incredibly massively funded across the world. And the professional speakers on them, they make their whole entire career of pushing the UFO agenda. They have late night talk shows that go on forever, years and years, with guys that were always members of the CIA and high clearances and so on that actually host them. You can't get away from this CIA connection with any and all of it, actually. Again, it came from the think tanks which were involved in, again, like the Fabian Society and all the other associated think tanks, which are massive today, of how to, if the people are catching on, there's too many things are wrong at any particular time, you must give them... I'm
going to change topics now and talk about the alien agenda, as it's been termed. The idea that we're all going to be invaded by little men from Mars or from somewhere in a far-off land, something like akin to Star Trek or something. Alan, in your research, where did this idea first come from?
War was so destructive, which of course it is, etc., etc., and we can't go on like this. We need some outside intervention. If only something outside would come and force us to unite the world to fight it, then we'd all come together under a global structure, which would be necessary to defend us all, and something to look at that could even be religious. So they came up with the idea, and also to unify the world. Remember, the goal was always to have world government with these groups, or world domination. And to get the people to go along with these things, they'd push up along the Marxist line, the continuous. Then they came out, of course, with the big movie. It was The Day the Earth Stood Still, where a big flying saucer lands outside the White House, I think it was. And the whole idea is that this alien has to get in touch with members of the United Nations, scientific members, though.